The dinner table is set for 12. White linen, porcelain plates, silver cutlery catching lamplight in a cramped apartment that smells of boiled potatoes and fear. Maria Kotarba, 16 years old, carries the serving dish with steady hands. Her fingers don't shake. They can't. Across from her sit German officers in pressed uniforms, laughing, joking, oblivious. They don't see the girl. They never do. Just another Polish servant, invisible in her worn dress, bringing food to men who've made occupation their comfortable routine. What they don't know is that Maria has spent the last 3 hours in a kitchen stained with more than cooking grease, grinding rat poison into fine powder, stirring it into gravy with the methodical precision of someone who understands that one mistake means a firing squad. She's done this 11 times before. 11 dinners. 11 carefully calculated doses. Not enough to kill immediately that would bring investigations, reprisals, mass executions of Polish families, just enough to sicken, to weaken, to send men back to Germany too ill to fight. As she sets the dish down, one officer looks up and smiles. "Danke schön," he says. Maria nods. Silent, already planning tomorrow's menu. This is the story of Maria Kotarba, the teenage girl who turned every meal into an act of war. Maria Kotarba wasn't born a resistance fighter. She was born into the kind of ordinary poverty that made girls invisible, the eldest daughter in a working-class Catholic family in Krakow, raised to cook, clean, serve, and survive. Her father worked in a factory. Her mother took in laundry. By age 14, Maria already knew how to stretch a potato into 3 meals and how to read the mood of a room before entering it. These weren't skills she thought would save her life. When German forces marched into Poland on September 1, 1939, Maria was just 13, standing in a bread line with her younger siblings, watching soldiers plaster propaganda posters over shop windows. She didn't understand strategy or politics or the mechanics of occupation. She understood hunger. She understood fear. And within months, she would understand something else. That the same invisibility that made her life difficult before the war would become her greatest weapon during it. The Kotarba apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a building that creaked in winter. 2 rooms, 7 people. Maria's mother hung wet laundry across lines strung between walls, creating a perpetual dampness that never quite dried. Her father came home each evening, smelling of machine oil and exhaustion, his hands scarred from factory work that paid less each month, as German authorities devalued Polish currency and redirected resources to the occupation infrastructure. Maria's childhood ended the day German administrative offices opened in requisitioned Polish buildings throughout Krakow. The occupation didn't just bring soldiers, it brought bureaucracy, clerks, administrators, officers who needed housing, feeding, cleaning. They commandeered the nicest apartments, displacing Polish families into increasingly cramped quarters, and they needed staff. Polish women and girls became the invisible machinery that kept German occupation running smoothly. They scrubbed floors in buildings that used to belong to their neighbors. They cooked meals with ingredients their own families couldn't access. They smiled when spoken to, kept their eyes down, and learned to become furniture present but unnoticed, functional but beneath consideration. For Maria, this invisibility was familiar. She'd been invisible before the war, too. The eldest daughter in a poor family, expected to sacrifice education for siblings, to work instead of learn, to serve instead of dream. Her teachers at the Catholic school said she was bright. It didn't matter. Bright girls from poor families still ended up in kitchens. But something else was forming in Maria during those first years of occupation. Something harder than the poverty she'd known before. She watched German soldiers laugh in cafes while Polish children begged outside. She saw neighbors arrested for violating curfew, for possessing forbidden books, for existing too loudly in their own city. She, heard stories whispered in church pews about mass executions, about entire families disappearing, about a brutality so casual it became routine. Her father said nothing. Survival meant silence. Resistance meant death, not just for the resistant but for their families. The Germans made that clear. Collective punishment, mass reprisals. The mathematics of occupation were simple: 1 dead German equaled 50 dead Poles. Maria absorbed these lessons. She learned to keep her face neutral when German soldiers shoved past her on sidewalks. She learned to say "yes, sir" in broken German. She learned to make herself small, forgettable, beneath notice. And she learned to watch. To observe routines and vulnerabilities. To understand that the men who occupied her city were human, which meant they ate, slept, sickened, died. Just like everyone else. She was 15 when the idea first formed. Not fully realized. Not yet a plan. Just a quiet recognition that the people who held all the power had one profound weakness. They never looked at the girl serving their dinner. The job came through desperation, not patriotism. By early 1942, Polish families in occupied Krakow were starving under German ration policies designed to favor the occupiers and punish the occupied. Maria's family needed money. The German administrative officers stationed in converted Polish apartments needed domestic staff, cooks, cleaners, girls who wouldn't ask questions. Maria was 15 when she first entered a German officer's residence, escorted by an older woman who taught her the rules. Eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. Never touch anything that isn't explicitly yours. She learned to cook German meals: schnitzel, sauerkraut, heavy stews. She learned their routines, their preferences, their casual cruelty. And she learned something else. These men trusted their food completely. They never questioned what a Polish girl brought to their table. Why would they? She was nobody. That realization, that utter, contemptuous dismissal, planted the first seed of resistance in Maria's mind. The apartment belonged to Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a logistics officer responsible for coordinating supply lines between Krakow and the Eastern Front. He was 43, methodical, and perpetually irritated by what he called the Polish problem, which meant everything about occupied Poland annoyed him. The food was wrong. The language was incomprehensible. The people were sullen and uncooperative. Maria cooked his meals 6 days a week: breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. Simple German fare prepared from rations he received through military channels, rations that included meat, butter, real coffee, luxuries Polish families hadn't seen in years. She learned his preferences quickly. He liked his coffee strong and black. He wanted potatoes with every meal. He complained if food was too cold or too hot, if there was too much salt or not enough. He never said thank you. He rarely looked at her face. This was true of all the German officers she worked for. Within months, Maria was cooking for 3 different households, rotating between apartments, learning the rhythms of occupation from the inside. She saw how casually they discussed operations that would kill Polish civilians. She heard them laugh about requisitioning food from villages already starving. She watched them treat Polish lives as administrative problems to be solved with paperwork and bullets. And every day, she brought them food. They ate without question. The transformation from servant to saboteur didn't happen in a single moment. It accumulated. One evening, Maria stood in Hauptmann Weber's kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, and realized she could put anything into this food. Anything. He would eat it. He trusted it. Completely. Then, is not Scimitar Num, as he couldn't conceive of a Polish servant girl as a threat. That night, she lay awake on the floor of her family's apartment. She'd given her spot on the mattress to her younger sisters and thought about poison. Not in abstract terms, in practical ones. What would be available? What wouldn't be traced? What would sicken but not kill immediately? Immediate death would bring investigations, reprisals, mass executions. The Germans always responded to resistance with overwhelming violence. Kill one of them, they'd kill 50 Poles. That was the equation. But make them sick? Make them weak, unable to work, invalided back to Germany. That was different. Mysterious illnesses happened, especially in occupied territories with poor sanitation, contaminated water, unfamiliar food. Maria had no training in chemistry or medicine. She had something more useful, desperation combined with careful observation. She knew the Germans feared disease. They obsessed over hygiene, over the supposed uncleanliness of occupied populations. If their officers started getting sick, they'd blame Polish sanitation, Polish cooking methods, Polish everything. They'd never blame the invisible girl who served their meals. The first time Maria obtained rat poison, her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the small paper packet. A woman at the market, someone Maria had seen in church, had pressed it into her palm with a whispered warning. Small amounts. Very small. Over time. That night, Maria ground a tiny portion into fine powder and stirred it into Hauptmann Weber's dinner stew. Just enough to make him uncomfortable. Not enough to kill. She served it with steady hands and a neutral face. He ate without comment. The kitchen had become her battlefield. Maria didn't work alone. She couldn't. What began as a solitary act of defiance evolved into something far more organized, far more dangerous. In the cramped apartments and market squares of occupied Krakow, a loose network of women and girls had formed: servants, cleaners, laundresses, all employed in German households, all invisible, all furious. They communicated through whispers in church pews, through coded conversations at the butcher's counter, through notes hidden in loaves of bread. Someone knew where to obtain rat poison from black market sources. Someone else understood dosing enough to incapacitate, not enough to kill immediately and trigger investigations. Maria became a key node in this network. Her position, cooking for multiple officers, giving her access other women didn't have. The system was brutally simple. Obtain poison, distribute it through trusted couriers, administer it in carefully measured quantities over time. The goal wasn't glory. It was attrition. Make the occupiers sick enough to go home. Make Poland just a little bit harder to occupy. One ruined stomach at a time. The network had no official name. No leader. No hierarchy. It existed in the spaces between German surveillance in markets where women shopped, in churches where they prayed, in bread lines where they waited. These were the only spaces where Polish women could gather without arousing immediate suspicion. The Germans expected women to shop, pray, wait. They didn't expect them to organize. Maria met Zofia in the queue outside St. Mary's Basilica on a cold morning in March 1942. Zofia was 19, a laundress who worked for German officers in the Podgorze district. She leaned close while they waited to enter, her breath visible in the freezing air, and whispered, "You work for Weber." It wasn't a question. Maria said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "I work for Oberleutnant Scholz," Zofia continued, eyes forward, voice barely audible. "He's been sick for 3 weeks. Stomach problems. The German doctors can't find anything wrong." Maria's heart hammered. She kept her face neutral. Around them, other women shuffled forward in the queue, hands tucked into worn coats, faces gray with cold and hunger. "Weber's been sick too," Maria said finally. 2 weeks now. Zofia nodded slowly. "Then, there are others." That was how it started. Not with grand declarations or dramatic meetings. With 2 girls whispering in a church queue, acknowledging what they were doing without saying it directly. Within weeks, Maria knew 6 other women involved in similar acts of sabotage. Within months, that number grew to 15. By 1943, the network included dozens of women and girls across Krakow, domestic servants, laundresses, cleaners, market vendors who supplied the poison, pharmacists' assistants who stole medications, even Polish nurses working in German military hospitals who documented the mysterious illnesses spreading through occupation forces. The poison came from multiple sources. Rat poison was easiest to obtain. Many buildings in occupied Krakow had rodent problems, and German authorities actually encouraged its use. But the network also used spoiled food allowed to fester, contaminated water introduced into German supplies, even ground glass mixed into meals in quantities small enough to cause internal bleeding without obvious trauma. The dosing was the most critical element. Too much poison meant immediate death, which meant investigations, interrogations, mass reprisals. Too little meant no effect. The women learned through terrible trial and error. They shared information carefully, learning which doses caused which symptoms, how to space out poisonings to avoid patterns, how to vary methods to prevent German authorities from identifying a common cause. Maria became particularly skilled at this. Her position cooking for multiple officers gave her repeated access and opportunity. She learned to vary her methods: poison in the stew one week, contaminated butter the next, spoiled milk the week after. She learned to read her targets, adjusting doses based on their size, health, eating habits. The psychological dimension was crucial. Every meal Maria served was an act of war, but it couldn't look like one. She had to remain the invisible servant, the forgettable girl, the nobody bringing food to men who barely registered her existence. One wrong expression, one moment of visible satisfaction when an officer fell ill, could unravel everything. So Maria learned to serve poisoned meals with the same neutral efficiency she'd served safe ones. She learned to show concern when officers complained of stomach pain, to suggest helpful remedies, to be the dutiful servant, expressing worry for her employer's health, all while planning the next dose. The network's success was measured in small victories. Officers invalided back to Germany. Administrative positions left vacant. Supply chains disrupted when logistics personnel were too sick to work. None of it was dramatic. None of it would appear in history books, but it added up to something tangible. The occupation became marginally harder, marginally more expensive, marginally less efficient, and no one suspected the girls who served the meals. Spring 1944. Maria has been poisoning German officers for nearly 2 years. She's 17 now, hardened in ways that have nothing to do with age and everything to do with proximity to death. The network has expanded. Dozens of women are involved. Hundreds of German soldiers and administrators have been sickened, invalided back to Germany, their effectiveness destroyed by mysterious gastrointestinal conditions that German military doctors can't diagnose. But expansion brings vulnerability. Networks grow larger, whispers grow louder, and eventually, someone talks. The Gestapo had been investigating the suspicious illness patterns for months. In occupied territories, they assume everything is sabotage: water supplies, food supplies, even the air if they could find evidence. When they finally piece together the connection between Polish domestic staff and sick German personnel, the arrests come fast and brutal. Maria is taken on a Tuesday morning, dragged from her family's apartment while her mother screams and her siblings watch. She knows what comes next: interrogation, torture, execution. The only question is whether she'll break before they kill her. The Gestapo came at dawn because they always came at dawn. The pounding on the door wasn't a knock, it was violence announcing itself, fists and rifle butts demanding entry into a space that offered no refuge. Maria was awake. She'd been awake for hours, lying on the floor beside her sleeping sisters, staring at the ceiling in the grey pre-dawn light. She'd known for 3 days that something was wrong. Zofia hadn't appeared at their usual meeting point outside the market. Another woman in the network, Aniela, had disappeared from her position in a German household without explanation. When networks collapse, they collapse fast. The door splintered open. Gestapo officers in leather coats filled the apartment, shouting in German, weapons drawn. Maria's mother screamed. Her father tried to stand, to position himself between the officers and his children, but he was shoved back against the wall with casual brutality. "Maria Kotarba," one officer said in Polish. "Not a question. An identification." Maria stood slowly, hands visible, trying to control the shaking that started in her legs and threatened to spread through her entire body. She'd imagined this moment hundreds of times. The arrest, the interrogation, the end. But imagination was nothing like the reality of rough hands grabbing her arms, metal handcuffs biting into her wrists, being dragged through the apartment while her younger siblings cried, and her mother's screams followed her down the stairs. The vehicle that took her to Montelupich prison was crowded. 7 other women, all handcuffed, all silent or crying. Maria recognized 3 of them from the network. The others might have been involved or might have been arrested on suspicion, swept up in the Gestapo's methodical approach to destroying resistance operations. Montelupich prison was where the Gestapo took people who weren't meant to come back. Everyone in Krakow knew this. The building loomed in the Podgorza district, its walls thick, its windows barred, its courtyard used for executions. Polish prisoners called it the place where hope died. The interrogation room smelled like blood and disinfectant, a combination that made Maria's stomach turn. She sat in a wooden chair, hands still cuffed, facing 2 Gestapo officers across a scarred table. Behind them, another officer stood by the door, silent, watching. They had files, papers spread across the table showing names, addresses, employment records. They knew about the network. Not everything, but enough. Someone had talked, or they'd pieced together patterns, or both. "You worked for Hauptmann Weber," the first officer said in Polish. He was young, maybe 30, with pale eyes that showed nothing. "For Oberleutnant Kraus, for Hauptsturmführer Dietrich, all of whom became seriously ill while you were employed in their households." Maria said nothing. Her throat was dry. Her hands, still cuffed, trembled slightly. "Several have died," the officer continued. "Others were invalided back to Germany. We've identified a pattern: Polish domestic staff, female, always cooking or handling food, and their employers, sick within weeks." He leaned forward. "You're part of an organized sabotage network. We know this. What we need from you is names. Who leads this network? Who supplies the poison? Who coordinates the operations?" Maria met his eyes and said the only thing she could. "I don't know what you're talking about." The first blow came fast, a backhand across her face that snapped her head sideways and filled her mouth with blood. She'd expected pain, expected violence. But the reality was worse than expectation, sharper, more immediate, more real. "Names," the officer said again. Maria swallowed blood and said nothing. Because there were no names to give that wouldn't doom others. Because the network had no leader, no hierarchy, no central coordination. Because the moment she gave them anything, she confirmed their theory and became a tool for destroying everyone else. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Then 6. Then she lost track, because time in that room became meaningless, measured only in questions and pain and the desperate effort to say nothing that would help them. The interrogation room in Montelupich prison smells like blood and disinfectant. Maria sits in a wooden chair, hands bound, facing Gestapo officers who can't quite reconcile what they've been told with. What they see: a thin, pale 17-year-old girl in a stained dress, looking more like she should be in a school classroom than a prison cell. They ask her about the poison network. She denies everything. They show her evidence, confessions from other arrested women, records of German personnel sickened while she worked in their households. She denies everything. They beat her. What the Gestapo can't understand is the very thing that kept Maria alive for 2 years. She is fundamentally underestimated. Even now, facing execution, she benefits from their inability to believe a teenage girl could be dangerous. They want to find the mastermind, the man who must be directing this operation. They waste weeks trying to extract a name that doesn't exist. And in those weeks, something unexpected happens. The war turns. Soviet forces push west. German forces retreat. Priorities shift. Maria, categorized as a minor participant despite evidence suggesting otherwise, is swept into a prison transport, heading west as the occupation collapses. She survives because they never believed she mattered enough to execute immediately. The weeks in Montelopich blurred together. Maria shared a cell with 11 other women in a space designed for 4. They slept in shifts on the concrete floor. Food came once daily: thin soup and black bread that tasted like sawdust. The cell had 1 bucket for waste. The smell was suffocating. But worse than the physical conditions was the psychological warfare. The Gestapo would randomly select women for interrogation, dragging them from the cell at unpredictable hours. Sometimes they returned, sometimes they didn't. The uncertainty was deliberate. Fear was a tool as effective as torture. Maria was interrogated 7 times over 3 weeks. Each session followed the same pattern. Questions about the network, demands for names, escalating violence when she gave them nothing useful. But something strange was happening. The officers were frustrated, angry, but also confused. They couldn't comprehend how a 17-year-old girl could be central to an organized resistance operation. Their questions kept circling back to the same assumption: who was the real leader? Which man was directing her? They showed her names of Polish resistance fighters, partisan leaders, underground organizers. Surely she was working for one of them. Maria realized, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion, that this confusion was saving her life. The Gestapo executed resistance leaders immediately. They were ruthless with partisan fighters, with saboteurs, with anyone they identified as truly dangerous. But Maria, they couldn't quite categorize her. She was 17, female, a domestic servant. Even with evidence connecting her to multiple poisoning cases, they couldn't believe she was anything more than a peripheral participant. So they kept interrogating her, kept demanding the name of the man who must be in charge, kept wasting time trying to extract information about a hierarchy that didn't exist. And while they wasted time, the war was changing. By June 1944, news filtered even into Montelopich. Whispered rumors passed between prisoners, fragments of information from guards, the distant sounds of artillery that grew gradually closer. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were pushing through eastern Poland. The occupation was collapsing. German authorities in Krakow began evacuating. Files were burned, offices were emptied, and prisoners who hadn't been executed became a logistical problem. They couldn't be left behind to testify about German war crimes. But there wasn't time or resources to process them all. Maria was loaded onto a transport train in late July with 200 other prisoners. The conditions were nightmarish: cattle cars, packed with bodies, no sanitation, summer heat, turning the enclosed spaces into suffocating ovens. People died standing up because there wasn't room for them to fall. The train moved west, toward Germany, stopping and starting as rail lines were bombed, as Soviet forces advanced, as the infrastructure of occupation disintegrated. Maria survived by being young, by being small enough to claim a corner near an air gap, by forcing herself to drink condensed water and eat whatever scraps were distributed. The transport reached a labor camp in eastern Germany in August. By then, Maria weighed less than 90 pounds. Her hair had been shaved. Her body was covered in sores. But she was alive. The camp was chaos. Guards were brutal but disorganized. The German war machine was collapsing, and everyone knew it. Prisoners were put to work in factories producing ammunition and equipment for an army that was losing on all fronts. The work was grueling. The food was inadequate. People died daily. But Maria had learned something profound over the past 2 years. She'd learned that invisibility was survival, that being underestimated was protection, that the powerful rarely looked carefully at those they considered powerless. She kept her head down, worked without complaint, attracted no attention. And when Soviet forces liberated the camp in April 1945, Maria was among the survivors. She weighed 78 pounds. She had tuberculosis. Her body bore scars from beatings and deprivation. But she had outlived the officers she'd poisoned, outlived the occupation, outlived the war. Maria Kotarba returned to Krakow in June 1945. Her family's apartment had been destroyed in the final battles. Her father had died. 2 of her siblings had perished. Her mother was living in a refugee center. They held each other and cried without speaking. There were no words for what they'd survived. No language adequate to the scale of loss. Maria never spoke publicly about the poison network. The post-war chaos meant many resistance activities went undocumented. The women involved returned to invisibility, became wives, mothers, workers in the rebuilt Poland. Their acts of sabotage remained unrecorded, uncelebrated, unknown. Maria lived until 1982. She married, raised 3 children, worked as a seamstress. Her family knew fragments of her wartime story, but never the full truth. She carried it quietly, the way survivors carry trauma privately, internally, without expectation of recognition. When she died, her obituary listed her as a survivor of Nazi occupation. It didn't mention that she'd fought back, one poisoned meal at a time. It didn't record that she'd weakened the occupation from within, using the very invisibility imposed on her as a weapon. But the officers she'd poisoned, the ones who survived, carried her legacy differently. Some returned to Germany with ruined health, unable to work, invalided out of service. Some died years later from complications rooted in those mysterious illnesses. Some simply never understood what had happened to them in occupied Poland. They'd never seen the girl who served their meals. She was nobody, invisible, forgettable, and that invisibility was Maria Kotarba's triumph.